The night Martha Bancroft walked into the dusty Spur Saloon in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1879, every man in the room turned to look at her, and not a single one of them moved to help her find a seat. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was comfortable, her worn brown traveling coat still dusty from the 3-day stage ride from Wichita, her dark hair pinned up with the kind of stubborn precision that said she had done it herself in a jolting carriage without a mirror, and she was not apologizing for it. She was 24 years old, tall for a woman, with sharp brown eyes that swept the room like she was taking inventory of everything she might need and everything she ought to avoid. She had a leather satchel slung over one shoulder and a small trunk that a boy from the stage line had dragged inside for her and deposited near the door with a grateful tip of his hat. The saloon was full that Friday evening. Cowboys in from the cattle drives that still rolled through Caldwell in those days, a few townsmen, a card dealer who never looked up from his table, and the piano player, old Hector Voss, who played the same 5 songs in rotation and never seemed to notice that anyone was listening. The smell was whiskey and sawdust and the ghost of tobacco, and the yellow lantern light made everyone look a little more tired and a little more golden than they probably deserved. Martha Bancroft moved inside with her chin level and her jaw set, and she walked directly to the bar. "I need a room," she said to the barkeep, a wide man named Dahlin with a red mustache that he was clearly very proud of. "I was told this establishment rents rooms." "We do," Dahlin said, looking her over with the particular brand of slow curiosity that frontier barkeeps had perfected over years of seeing every kind of person come through a door. $2 a week, meals not included. "You got business in Caldwell?" "I do," Martha said simply, and she paid him from a small coin purse that she tucked back into her satchel with a practiced motion. She did not elaborate, and something in the flat steadiness of her gaze told Dahlin not to press the question. She had business in Caldwell. That was true. What she did not say, because it was not Dahlin's affair, was that the business was complicated and the situation was precarious, and she had arrived in this town with $43 to her name and a letter of introduction to the owner of the Caldwell Clarion newspaper, who had advertised in the Wichita papers for a compositor and general writing assistant. She had answered the advertisement because she could set type faster than most men she had ever worked beside, and because she had spent the last 2 years in Wichita working for the Eagle until the editor's wife had decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with Martha's competence, that it was inappropriate for a woman to work in a newsroom. She had been let go with 1 week's pay and a handshake that felt like an apology, and she had stood outside that building on a Tuesday morning in September and looked up and down the busy street of Wichita and made herself a promise that she would not be dismissed so casually again. She had come to Caldwell to start over. It was not the first time she had started over, and she suspected it would not be the last. Dahlin showed her to a room on the upper floor of the saloon, a small square space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. The noise from below would be considerable in the evenings, she knew, but she had slept through worse. She set her trunk at the foot of the bed and her satchel on the single chair, and sat for a moment on the edge of the mattress, pressing her hands flat against her thighs, letting herself feel the exhaustion of the journey before she put it away somewhere sensible. She was hungry. She had not eaten since a dry biscuit at the last relay station some 6 hours past. She could hear music starting up below, that reliable piano churning out something vaguely resembling a polka, and the sound of voices lifting in the particular way they did when a Friday evening crowd decided collectively to have a good time. She changed her collar, straightened her hair as best she could, and went back downstairs. The saloon had grown louder in the 20 minutes she had been upstairs. More people had come in, and someone had cleared space in the center of the room, where a few couples were attempting to dance on the uneven floorboards with varying degrees of success. Martha found a small table near the wall, flagged down a girl who was carrying plates, and ordered the beef stew that appeared to be the only hot thing available. She ate it when it came with steady focus, watching the room the way she always watched rooms, cataloging the details that told her what kind of place this was and what kind of people lived here. That was when she first saw Aaron Whitaker. He came through the saloon door with two other men, cattle hands by the look of them, their boots carrying the particular dust and wear that spoke of long days on horseback. He was perhaps 27 or 28, lean in the way that hard outdoor work made a man lean, with dark blonde hair that had been cut recently but not recently enough, and a jaw that was clean-shaved and would be stubbled again by morning. He wore a dark coat over a collarless shirt, and he had a quality that Martha noticed immediately and could not quite name, something in the way he moved through the crowd, steady and unhurried, not pushing past people but finding the natural gaps between them, as if he had long since decided that the world would make room for him if he was patient enough. He was not the kind of man who demanded attention. He was the kind of man who had it anyway. He went to the bar with his companions, a man named Roy Cutler who had a loud laugh that carried over the piano, and a younger fellow, barely grown, who everyone seemed to call Pinto on account of a birthmark on his neck. Martha learned these details in the way she always learned details, by watching and listening without appearing to do either. She finished her stew and ordered coffee from the same girl, who was harried and kind in equal measure, and she sat with her coffee and watched the dancing in the center of the room. She was aware, with a precision that she would not have admitted to, that Aaron Whitaker had glanced in her direction twice since sitting down at the bar. The second time, he had held the look for a moment longer than passing curiosity would account for, and then he had looked away. Martha Bancroft did not look away. She looked directly at him for the space of 2 full seconds with the calm, evaluating gaze of a woman who had learned not to waste time pretending she had not noticed things, and then she returned her attention to her coffee. The dancing was a rough, cheerful affair. There were more men than women in the room, as there always were in frontier towns, and the women who danced did so with the relaxed confidence of people who knew they were in demand. One of them, a handsome woman of perhaps 30 with red hair and an emerald green dress, was clearly the best dancer in the room, and the men around her seemed to know it, taking their turns with the eager, temporary pride of people who knew the credit was really hers. Martha watched the dancing and felt something she would not have named as longing precisely, but which lived in the same neighborhood. She had danced once. In another life, it felt like, back in Missouri before everything had gone wrong, before her father's farm had been lost to debts that weren't really his fault and her mother had passed in the winter of 1874, and the world had rearranged itself into a shape she had not been consulted about. She had danced at a church social in the town of Haverford, Missouri, when she was 17 years old, and a boy named Thomas Pruitt had held her hand too tightly and stepped on her feet 4 times, and she had laughed until she cried because even the bad dancing had been wonderful. She had not danced since, not once in 7 years. She did not think about it consciously. She just watched the center of the room with her coffee cup held in both hands and told herself she was simply observing, cataloging, doing what she always did. Then Roy Cutler's loud laugh cut through the music, and she heard him say, clearly and with the cheerful cruelty of a man who had had 2 whiskeys and thought himself very clever, "Go on then, Whitaker, ask the plain one sitting by herself. Somebody ought to show some Christian charity." Martha's hands tightened around the coffee cup. She did not look at the bar. She stared at the center of the room and felt the words land in her chest with the particular weight of casual unkindness, the kind that was not even aimed precisely, just scattered like buckshot, and still managed to find you. She heard the small silence that followed, the kind of silence that means someone is deciding something. She heard footsteps. She made herself breathe evenly. Aaron Whitaker appeared at the edge of her table and stood there for a moment. She looked up at him with a gaze that she had spent years making into something cool and unbothered, and she waited for whatever awkward, pitying thing he was about to say. He looked uncomfortable. That was the honest word for it. He had the look of a man who had gotten himself into a situation by half and was now working out how to manage the rest of it with some kind of dignity. His hat was in his hands, turned by the brim, and there was a faint color along the line of his jaw that might have been embarrassment or might have been the heat of the room. "I wonder," he said, and his voice was quieter than she had expected, a low, even voice with a slight Western plainness to it, "if you would like to dance." Martha looked at him for a long, level moment. She could say no. She could say no and finish her coffee and go upstairs to her narrow room and lie awake in the noise of the saloon, and that would be entirely reasonable, and she would lose nothing except the humiliation of having accepted a dance offered as charity by a man whose friend had called her the plain one sitting by herself. But there was something else happening in Martha Bancroft in that moment, something that had been building for 2 years of being dismissed from a newsroom by a woman who was afraid of her, and 3 days on a stage coach that smelled of other people's anxiety, and $43 and a letter of introduction, and the exhausting daily work of starting over with nothing but her own competence to recommend her. She was tired of being looked at and looked past. She was tired of being managed and assessed and found insufficient. She was tired of the particular way the world treated women who were capable and alone, and not soft enough at the edges to be comfortable. She set her coffee cup down on the table with a precise, deliberate motion. "Yes," she said, "I would." She stood up, and Aaron Whitaker offered his hand, and she took it, and they walked together to the center of the room. Old Hector Voss, with whatever sixth sense piano players develop over years of watching rooms, chose that moment to shift from the polka he had been grinding through and into something slower, a waltz of sorts, loose and frontier-shaped but recognizably a waltz. Martha felt the shift in tempo and adjusted without thinking, because the music told her to, and she put her left hand on Aaron Whitaker's shoulder and her right hand in his, and she looked at a point past his shoulder, and she began to dance. She danced like she had something to prove. She had not danced in 7 years, but the body remembers things that the mind keeps locked away, and what came up from the stored-away place inside her was not the uncertain, girlish stepping of that church social in Haverford, Missouri. What came up was something older and more decided, a kind of physical intelligence that had always been in her and had simply been waiting for the room and the music and the moment. She moved with a precision and an unself-consciousness that was not at all what Aaron Whitaker had prepared for, and she knew it. She could feel it in the slight stiffening of his hand, the way he recalibrated his expectations of her in the space of about 3 steps. She did not look at him directly. She moved through the steps with a clean, unhurried authority, her back straight and her chin level, turning when the music said to turn, following his lead where his lead was good and providing her own where it wasn't, and there was nothing apologetic or tentative about any of it. There was something luminous and contained about the way she moved, something that had no interest at all in being watched for any reason except the dancing itself, and that indifference to observation made it all the more worth watching. Around them, the other dancers gradually, and without conspicuousness, slowed and shifted. The woman in the green dress stopped entirely and stood at the edge with her partner and watched with her arms folded and an expression that was part assessment and part something that looked like recognition. Roy Cutler stopped laughing. Even Pinto, who had the short attention span of a man barely 20, was watching from the bar with his mouth slightly open. Aaron Whitaker was speechless, not figuratively. He had gone genuinely, completely quiet, and his eyes were on Martha Bancroft with an attention that had ceased, somewhere between the first turn and the second, to have any quality of pity or charity in it at all. What was in it now was something simpler and more complicated at once, the honest bewilderment of a man who had expected one thing and encountered another thing entirely, and could not decide whether he was thrilled by the difference or undone by it. Martha felt his attention shift. She felt it the way you feel a change in the weather, not through any single sense, but through a general, full-body awareness that something in the atmosphere had changed. She let herself look at him then, directly, with her brown eyes steady, and her expression not quite neutral but not inviting interpretation either. He was looking at her like he was trying to solve a problem, and she recognized the look because she had seen it on men's faces before when she had done something they had not anticipated, and she had learned not to trust it because the surprise was usually followed by a retreat to familiar ground. Men encountered unusual women and were briefly fascinated, and then went back to the women they understood. But she was dancing, and the music was good, and she was 24 years old and she had $43, and she was not going to spend the rest of this dance managing her own expectations for someone else's comfort. So she held his gaze for a full measure of the waltz and she danced, and she let whatever showed in her face show there, and then she looked past his shoulder again because the dancing was its own thing and it belonged to her. When the music ended, she dropped her hands and took a small step back. "Thank you," she said, with the same cool, composed courtesy she would have used for any ordinary transaction. Aaron Whitaker stood looking at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked briefly, like a man who had just walked into a room expecting it to be empty, and found it full of something magnificent and alarming. "Miss," he said finally, "that was the finest dancing I have seen in this county or possibly any other." Martha Bancroft permitted herself a small, private smile. "You are very kind," she said, and then she returned to her table and picked up her coffee cup, which had gone cold, and she finished it anyway because cold coffee was still coffee, and she was not the kind of woman who left things half done. She did not look at him again that night, but she knew, with the quiet animal certainty that lives below conscious thought, that he was looking at her. She went upstairs when the saloon noise had shifted from lively to merely persistent, and she lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sound of Caldwell, Kansas, and she thought about the dance, about the way her body had remembered what she had thought she had forgotten, about the look on Aaron Whitaker's face, that genuine, open-mouthed stillness that she had put there with nothing more than herself, moving through the space she had been given. She fell asleep with something in her chest that was not quite happiness but was in the same general direction, and she slept better than she had in weeks. The following Monday morning, Martha presented herself at the offices of the Caldwell Clarion at 9 o'clock sharp with her letter of introduction and her compositing tools, which she had carried in a small fitted case all the way from Wichita. The Clarion occupied a building on the main street that smelled beautifully of ink and paper and hot metal, a smell that Martha associated with safety and purpose, the way other people associated it with home. The press was a Washington hand press, serviceable and well-maintained, and she looked at it the way a sailor looks at a good ship and felt her shoulders come down from where they had been for 3 days. The owner of the Clarion was a man named Samuel Giddings, who was 55 and wore spectacles, and had the distracted, perpetually ink-stained manner of a man who had always cared more about the news than about his own presentation. He read her letter of introduction with the careful attention of a man who read everything carefully, and then he looked at her over the tops of his spectacles. "You set type for the Wichita Eagle," he said. "For 2 years," Martha said. "I can set and print a full 4-page edition in 6 hours with 2 assistants, or 8 hours alone. I can write a straight news piece as fast as I can take notes, and I can correct grammar and spelling in column proof without marking through more than 15% of the copy." Samuel Giddings was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man who had not quite expected this. "The position pays $12 a month," he said, "plus room, but I see you have found accommodation already." "Yes, I would take the $12 and work without room provision." "The previous compositor was a man," Giddings said, not unkindly, with the mildly apologetic tone of someone raising a practical objection they themselves do not find persuasive. "I know," Martha said. I have been the only woman in every newsroom I have ever worked in. It has not affected the quality of the type." Samuel Giddings looked at her for another moment. Then he smiled, a small, tired, genuine smile. "No, I suppose it wouldn't," he said. "Can you start Wednesday?" "I can start today," Martha said, "if you have work that needs doing." He did have work that needed doing. She started that day. Within a week, she had settled into a routine that gave her a kind of bedrock satisfaction, the deep, reliable comfort of useful work. She arrived at the Clarion at 7:30, before Giddings himself, and she read through the previous day's notes and began setting type with the quiet, methodical speed that was her particular gift. She had a natural instinct for the page, a sense of how information should sit on paper so that the eye followed it willingly. And Giddings, who had been setting his own type with competence but without elegance for 20 years, noticed the difference in the first edition she laid out and did not say anything about it but began, quietly and without announcement, to give her more latitude in the design of each page. She wrote pieces too. She went to the courthouse and the general store and the stockyards and the small churches, and she listened to people, and she wrote what they told her with the kind of plain, exact prose that made news readable instead of merely informative. She wrote about the cattle trade and the drought conditions, and a dispute over land rights that had been simmering since 1876, and she wrote about a woman named Clara Dupree, who had opened the first millinery shop in Caldwell and was doing remarkable business, and about a young Comanche man named Runs Quickly who had been arrested for horse theft on evidence that even the county judge had described as circumstantial and insufficient, a piece that she wrote with careful, precise outrage, and that Giddings published with one small edit and a notable lack of commentary, which was his version of saying he agreed with her. She was finding her footing. She was becoming someone in this town, not conspicuously, not loudly, but in the way that capable people become someone, by being reliably present and reliably useful and slowly, incrementally known. And she had not seen Aaron Whitaker again. She had thought about the dance more times than she would have admitted, not with longing exactly, or not only with longing. She thought about it the way you think about a moment that felt true, that had some quality of significance that you recognized even if you couldn't quite name it. She had danced like she had something to prove, and she had proved it, and there had been a man who had been speechless because of her, and that had mattered to her more than it should have, perhaps, but she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that it had mattered. She did not know who Aaron Whitaker was. She had not asked. She learned, eventually, the way you learn things in a small frontier town, incidentally, through the overlapping edges of other conversations. He had a ranch to the northeast of town, a modest spread called the Crosty, where he ran cattle and a few horses. He had come to Caldwell from Texas originally, 5 years past, and had built the place from a single land claim and 3 years of the kind of work that leaves permanent marks on a person's hands. He was well regarded in the community, which in Caldwell meant he paid his debts and did not start trouble, and he was known to be fair with his hands, which meant more than the paying of debts because a lot of men paid their debts and treated their workers badly. He was not married. She learned this too, incidentally, through the particular frequency with which other women mentioned it when his name came up. She was not thinking about that. She was thinking about the newspaper. She was thinking about the piece she was writing about the proposed rail extension, and whether it would benefit or undermine the existing cattle trade routes, a question that had more layers than it appeared to on the surface, and that she had been researching for 2 weeks with the tenacious pleasure of someone who genuinely liked difficult questions. She was not thinking about Aaron Whitaker. Then he walked into the Clarion on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of October, while she was alone at the compositing table and elbow-deep in a particularly stubborn column of type that had gotten itself out of alignment, and she looked up and found him standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and that same quality of unhurried steadiness about him, and she felt something in her chest do a brief, embarrassing thing that she immediately suppressed. "Afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," she said, in a perfectly level voice that she was proud of. "I was looking for Mr. Giddings. He is at the courthouse this afternoon. He is covering a hearing on the land rights matter." She paused because the natural courtesy of the situation required it, and also because she was aware of him in a way that she found vaguely annoying but did not deny. "Is there something I can help you with? I work here." "I know," he said. "I read your piece about runs quickly." She set down the type she was holding and gave him her full attention. "Did you? It was a good piece." He was direct about it, not effusive, just stating a fact in the same tone he might use to say the weather was good or the road was passable. It said what needed saying in a way that a person couldn't dismiss. Martha studied him for a moment. People who had read that piece either agreed with it and said so plainly, or disagreed with it and were agitated about it. He had the calm of someone who had thought about it before he walked through the door. "Thank you," she said. "What is your business with Mr. Giddings?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she had the strange feeling that he had not really come about Mr. Giddings at all, that Mr. Giddings was a reason that was structurally convenient, and she felt a slight, unwilled warmth that she told herself was purely the heat from the typesetting stove. "I wanted to inquire about placing a notice," he said, "about a horse auction on the 14th. "I can take the details for a notice," she said. "It is 5 cents per line." He came inside and she took his notice, writing the details in her quick, precise hand, and she was very composed and professional about all of it, and she did not look at him longer than necessary. And when the transaction was done, he thanked her and she nodded, and she expected him to leave. He did not immediately leave. He stood for a moment in the way that people stand when they have another thing to say and are calculating whether to say it. "I don't believe I introduced myself properly," he said. "The other evening. I am Aaron Whitaker. I have the Crosty Ranch northeast of town." "I know," she said, and then, because honesty was a principle she held to even when it was inconvenient, "I am Martha Bancroft. I suspect you knew that already as well." A small, slightly surprised smile crossed his face. It changed his expression considerably, made him look younger and more open, and she registered it before she could stop herself. "I did know it," he said. "Miss Bancroft," a pause. "I owe you an apology." She raised her eyebrows. "For the manner in which I asked you to dance." His voice was even, but there was something effortful in it. The effort of a man who was saying something he had thought out in advance because he knew it was right, and doing what was right in this particular area did not come easily. "You heard what Royce said. I imagine most people in the room did. I should not have listened to him, and I should not have made your evening into a joke that was aimed at you." Martha was quiet for a moment. She had a number of things she could say to this, and she was choosing between them. "You did ask me," she said finally. "Whatever the reason, you came over and you asked, and I said yes, and I danced. The apology belongs to your friend, not to you." "Roy is not always thoughtful." "No," she agreed, "but he was honest in his way. He said what was in the room, the plain one sitting by herself. She said it without flinching because she had already taken the sting out of it through repetition in her own mind, and she was not going to give him the discomfort of watching her wince at it. I have been called worse and meant less by it. What matters to me is what happened after." He looked at her with those steady, slightly puzzled eyes. "What happened after?" She met his gaze fully. "I danced," she said simply, "and you were speechless." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that a room settles into when something true has been said, and the people in it are deciding what to do with the truth. Then Aaron Whitaker laughed. It was a genuine, unguarded laugh, not the loud performance of Roy Cutler's laugh, but something quieter and more surprised, and it did something to the whole shape of his face that Martha found very difficult to look away from. "That is fair," he said. "That is more than fair." A pause. "You dance extraordinarily well, Miss Bancroft." "I know," she said, and she was smiling now, a real smile, the kind she did not deploy often because it felt too much like giving something away. "Is there anything else you needed for the notice?" "No," he said. "That covers it." He left. She turned back to the compositing table and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the cool metal and felt the smile still on her face and did not fight it. Over the following weeks, Caldwell settled into the particular rhythm of a frontier town moving from high autumn into early winter. The cattle drives were tapering off as the season changed, but the town retained a lively bustle built on the commerce they had brought. Martha was busy. The Clarion published twice weekly, and she was producing more of its content than Giddings had originally hired her to produce, a development that had happened organically, and that Giddings accepted with the grateful equanimity of a man who had been trying to do too much himself for too long. She was writing a series of pieces about the communities outside the town, the smaller farms and homesteads that were not often covered, because their inhabitants rarely came to the newspaper office to make themselves known. She went out to them herself, borrowing a horse from the stable on Maple Street, a patient bay mare named Duchess who tolerated Martha's riding with the resignation of a horse that had seen many riders, and found most of them adequate but none of them particularly inspired. On one of these excursions in early November, she found herself on the road northeast of Caldwell, which passed within a quarter-mile of the Crosty Ranch. She had not planned it this way. She was on her way to the Heller homestead, 7 miles out, to interview a family of Swedish immigrants who had come to Kansas the previous spring and were attempting to grow winter wheat on land that the more established farmers considered marginal. She had good notes already, and she wanted to see the fields. But her road passed near the Crosty, and the Crosty had a long fence line along the road, and as she rode past she could see, at a distance, a man on horseback working cattle in a field, riding in long, patient curves around the edge of a small herd that he was moving from one part of the pasture to another. She could not have identified him from the road, not with certainty. But she knew the quality of the riding, that same unhurried, capable ease that she had watched move through a saloon, and she did not stop. She went on to the Heller homestead and spent 2 hours with Astrid Heller, who was 40 and had a handshake like a blacksmith and 5 children, and an opinion about every aspect of Kansas agriculture that she delivered in direct, clearly enunciated English, that she had been teaching herself from a primer she had acquired in Topeka. Martha wrote 4 pages of notes, and left with the warm, satisfied feeling she always got from talking to someone who was doing a difficult thing with genuine conviction. On the way back, the light was going and the temperature had dropped, and she rode a little faster, and as she passed the fence line of the Crosty again, the man she had seen earlier was no longer in the field. He was at the fence. Aaron Whitaker was leaning on the fence post at the corner where the road turned, as if he had simply ridden over on some unrelated business and happened to be there, and he raised a hand in the unhurried greeting of a man who was not going to pretend he hadn't seen her. Martha pulled Duchess to a walk. "Miss Bancroft," he said, "you are out far from town." "I was at the Heller place," she said. "I am writing a piece about their wheat." He nodded, looking at her in the failing light with an expression that she could not read with confidence from horseback. "It is a long ride back after dark." "I know how far it is," she said pleasantly. "I did not mean to suggest otherwise." A pause. "I was going to offer coffee if you had a moment. We have a cook fair going and it is a cold evening." Martha looked at him. She looked at the road ahead of her. She looked at the darkening sky with the sensible, weather-reading eye of someone who had been traveling alone in this country for long enough to know when conditions were worth noting. "1 cup," she said, and turned Duchess toward the gate. The Crosty Ranch was modest and well-ordered, the kind of place that told you things about its owner without him having to say them. The main house was a solid construction of timber and prairie stone, small but sound, with a covered porch and a kitchen garden to the south side that had been put to bed for the winter with the neat, tidy attention of someone who already knew what they would plant in the spring. There was a barn that was larger than the house, which she regarded as entirely sensible, and several smaller outbuildings in good repair, and the whole property had the spare, deliberate look of a man who had built it piece by piece and thought carefully about each piece before putting it in place. Roy Cutler and Pinto were not there. There was a ranch hand named Cobb who nodded at her from the barn doorway with the incurious manner of a man who had seen many things and found most of them unremarkable, and that was all. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee that was strong and very good, and Aaron Whitaker sat across from her, and they talked about the Heller family and the wheat and the question of whether the northern part of Comanche County was genuinely viable for winter grain or whether it was a hope that the land would not support. He had opinions about this. He had, she discovered, opinions about many things, formed quietly and held without aggression. The kind of opinions that came from paying attention to the world over a long period rather than from reading one newspaper once and deciding you had understood everything. They talked about the land rights dispute that she was covering, which turned out to have a dimension she had not yet found, a question about water access from a seasonal creek that crossed several claim boundaries. And Aaron had information about this that he offered with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone sharing a tool rather than a secret. She wrote notes in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket, and he watched her write with that slightly surprised look that she was beginning to recognize as his characteristic response to the gap between what he expected of her and what she actually was. "You don't stop working," he observed. It was not a criticism. It sounded more like the identification of a quality he recognized. "I don't know how to," she said honestly. "Is that a failing?" "I think it depends on the work," he said, with his careful, plain thoughtfulness. She stayed for one cup of coffee and then a second because the conversation was genuinely interesting and the warmth of the kitchen was considerable, and she admitted to herself, not in a hurry to leave. She was aware of being in his house, of the particular domestic quietness of it, the way a man's space holds the impression of him. There was a small shelf of books near the kitchen window, which she noticed and did not comment on, and a rifle above the door that was clean and functional and did not appear to have been used recently, and a coat on the hook that was worn at the elbows in the way of a coat that is used often and without ceremony. When she finally stood and said she should make the road before full dark, he walked her outside and held Duchess's bridle while she mounted, which was a small courtesy but a considered one, and she thanked him and rode out toward the gate, and he stayed at the fence post, a tall, composed shape against the darkening sky, and she did not look back, but she knew he was there. She wrote the Heller piece over the following 2 days, and it was one of the best things she had written for the Clarion, clear and particular, and honest about the difficulty and the dignity of what the family was attempting. Giddings read it in proof and said, quietly, that it was very good, and she took the compliment without diminishing it and went back to the compositing table and set the type with a thoroughness that felt like a form of gratitude. Aaron Whitaker came back to the Clarion the following week with another notice, which she suspected he did not particularly need to place in person, and they talked for 20 minutes about the water rights angle in the land dispute because she had followed it up and had new information, and he was genuinely interested. The week after that, she saw him at the general store, and they stood in the aisle between the dry goods and the harness supplies and talked for half an hour while old Percival Briggs, who owned the store and had all the patience of a man who had been in one place for a very long time, worked around them with the studied indifference of a professional. She was aware of what was happening. She was not naive. She was a 24-year-old woman who had come to a new town with $43 and a satchel and a specific, worked-out plan for her own life. And that plan had not included a man with a ranch northeast of town and a shelf of books and a quality of attention that made her feel, when he was looking at her, like the most fully present version of herself. She was aware of it and she was not fighting it exactly, but she was watching it carefully, the way you watch a river in flood, with respect for what it might become. She was also writing a piece about a woman named Dolores Varga, who ran a boarding house on the south end of Caldwell, and had, for the past decade, quietly been one of the most important sources of financial credit in the town, loaning small amounts to families in difficulty, and running her accounts with a precision and a generosity that had kept more than a dozen local enterprises from failing. Dolores was Mexican-American, and she had arrived in Caldwell before most of the current population, at a time when Caldwell was barely a crossroads, and she had built her boarding house and her reputation and her informal lending operation in a community that had not always made it easy for her to do any of those things. Martha's piece about her was careful and admiring and addressed, in plain terms, the way in which Dolores' contributions to the town had been systematically undercredited because of who she was. Giddings published it. There were people in town who were annoyed by it. Martha received 2 letters through the newspaper office, one of which was thoughtful and the other of which was not, and she read both with equal attention and answered neither. Aaron Whitaker mentioned it to her at the general store, the same way he had mentioned the Runs Quickly piece, directly and without performance. He said it was important. She looked at him for a moment and said she thought so too, and that she was glad Giddings had been willing to print it as written, and Aaron nodded slowly as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Do you ever write about things that don't require some courage to say?" he asked. The question surprised a laugh out of her. "Sometimes," she said. "I wrote a very uncontroversial piece about the autumn cattle prices last month." "I remember reading it," he said. "It was not uncontroversial. You said the buyers from the railroad consortium were deliberately misrepresenting the market conditions to the ranchers." She thought about it. "That is true," she said. "I suppose courage is relative." He was smiling at her, and she was smiling back. An old Percival Briggs behind the counter was carefully examining a bolt of calico with the expression of a man who was thinking about something else entirely. November moved toward December, and the weather turned serious in the way that Kansas weather turns serious, not gradually but all at once, as if the plains had been waiting for permission. Martha's room at the dusty spur became cold at night and warm in the mornings when Dolan started the downstairs stove early, and she acquired a wool blanket from the general store and a second pair of thick stockings, and adapted to the cold with the practical, unromantic efficiency that she applied to most of the physical challenges of her life. She was invited to supper at Aaron's ranch on a Saturday in late November, and she accepted with the same composed straightforwardness with which she accepted every invitation that seemed worthwhile. She dressed in her good wool dress, which was dark green and fitted well, and which she had bought 2 years ago in Wichita for a newspaper function, and which remained the nicest thing she owned, and she borrowed Duchess again and rode out in the early evening cold. He had cooked. This surprised her, and she was not careful enough to entirely hide the surprise, and he smiled at her surprise with a trace of satisfied amusement, and explained that he had been cooking for himself for 8 years, and had gotten reasonably good at it on the grounds that the alternative was getting bad at it and starving. The supper was beef stew, different from the dusty spur version in the way that home cooking is always different from saloon cooking, more particular, more tended, with the evidence of care in it. There was bread that he had baked himself, which was perhaps slightly uneven in its rising but very good, and there was a jar of preserves that turned out to have been made by Dolores Varga, of all people, who apparently supplied half the ranches in the county with fruit preserves every autumn. They ate and they talked, and the conversation moved more freely than it had in any of their previous encounters, without the slight formality that public spaces impose. They talked about Texas, where he had come from, and Missouri, where she had come from, and the different ways the 2 places had shaped them. He had a younger sister, Lydia, who was married in San Antonio and had 2 small boys, and he spoke of her with the particular fond, slightly baffled affection of an older brother, who has watched a younger sibling turn into a person who knows more than him about certain important things. She had no siblings, and he received this information with a quiet look of something she thought might be sympathy, and decided not to analyze. She told him about her father's farm in Haverford and what had happened to it, because the conversation had come to a place where it was the natural, true thing to say, and she told it plainly and without self-pity, the way she had learned to tell everything, and he listened with a complete and attentive stillness that she realized was one of the things she most valued about him. He did not rush to comfort or to redirect. He simply heard what she said and held it, and that capacity for simply hearing something hard without trying to fix it or minimize it was not common, and she found it more affecting than she would have predicted. "What do you want?" he asked her when the supper was mostly done and the evening had settled into the comfortable slowness of a fire burning low in a warm room. "Here in Caldwell. What are you building?" The question was so direct and so genuine that she answered it without the usual protective detour. "A life that belongs to me," she said. "Work that I'm good at and that matters. A place I made for myself instead of one I inherited or was given or stumbled into." She paused. "I have had to leave 3 places in 6 years for reasons that had nothing to do with my work and everything to do with the fact that someone else decided I did not fit. I want to find a place that won't do that." He was quiet, looking at her with those steady, thinking eyes. "Caldwell is not a perfectly just place," he said carefully. "No place is," she said. "But Giddings lets me write what I think is true, and the town reads it, and some of them change their minds about things. That is as much as I can ask. It is more than most people manage," he said. She looked at him across the table in the firelight, this man who had asked her to dance as a kindness and been undone by what she did with the kindness, who had come to her with an apology and stayed to become something she had not anticipated, and she felt the full weight of what was happening between them, which was no longer something she was merely observing. She was falling in love with him. The recognition did not come with the theatrical fanfare of dime novel love stories. It came quietly, in the firelight, with the evidence of a supper he had cooked and bread he had baked, and a question asked with genuine interest in her real answer. It came with the cumulative weight of every conversation and every shared look and every moment of his complete, unhurried attention, and it settled in her chest with the solidity of something true. She was not going to say it. Not tonight. She was a woman who moved carefully through the world because she had learned that the world did not always make room for her, and she was not going to rush toward something so important that moving too fast could ruin it. But she was in love with him, and she knew it, and she sat in his kitchen in her good green wool dress and held the knowledge the way you hold something precious, with both hands and without squeezing. She rode back to Caldwell in the cold dark with the stars very bright overhead and Duchess's breath making small clouds in the night air, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. December arrived with a hard freeze that locked the ground solid and brought the town indoors. The Clarion's office was warm from the typesetting stove, and Martha spent long days there, working on the twice-weekly editions, and on a longer piece she was writing about the water rights question, which had finally come to a formal hearing and was generating more heat than anyone had anticipated. She had attended 2 days of the hearing and filled a notebook, and was now trying to render the complicated legal and human reality of the dispute in prose that a general reader could follow, and that was still honest about who stood to benefit from each possible outcome. She saw Aaron regularly now. It had become a habit so natural that she realized she had stopped noticing the individual decision to see him and had simply incorporated him into the texture of her days. He came to town for supplies on Wednesdays usually, and on Wednesdays they ate at the small cafe that had opened in October on the main street, run by a widow named Mrs. Fremont, where the chicken and dumplings were excellent and the coffee was always hot. They talked about his ranch and her writing and the news from around the territory and the books on his shelf, which she had finally asked about and which had turned out to be a well-assorted collection. some practical volumes on cattle and land management, a battered copy of Dickens, 2 books by Mark Twain, and a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson that he had read so many times the spine had given way and been repaired with cowhide. He came to her one Wednesday in mid-December with a look she had not seen on him before, slightly tight around the eyes in a way that was not his usual composure. "I have a problem," he said, sitting down across from her at Mrs. Fremont's table. "Roy Cutler." She waited. He told her that Roy had been making a deal with one of the railroad buyers, the same consortium she had written about in the cattle prices piece, and the deal had a dimension to it that was not legal, involving claims to grazing land that Roy did not legitimately hold, and a document that Roy had apparently represented as authentic when it was not. Aaron had found out about it incidentally, through a conversation he was not supposed to have heard, and now he was in the position of knowing something about a man he had worked alongside for 3 years that he did not know what to do with. "What will you do?" Martha asked. "I don't know yet," he said, and he looked at her with the direct, searching honesty of a man who was asking a question by not asking it. "You know what is right," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "Then the question is whether you will do it or whether you will decide the cost is too high." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the December wind was pressing against Mrs. Fremont's window, and the town moved past in its bundled, purposeful winter rhythm. "It will cost me the friendship," he said. "Yes, and probably the working relationship. Roy and I have shared hands for 2 seasons. "Yes," he looked at her. "You are not going to tell me it will be all right." "I don't know that it will be all right," she said honestly. "I know that it is right. Those are different things." He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "they are." He reported what he knew to the county sheriff the following day. The investigation that followed was not quick or clean, but it was thorough, and by February it had resulted in Roy Cutler losing the fraudulent land claim and paying a substantial fine and leaving Caldwell for somewhere further west. Aaron lost the working relationship and most of the friendship, as predicted, and he bore this with the same quiet endurance with which he bore most difficult things. He came to tell Martha when it was resolved, and she listened, and she said she was sorry it had cost him what it had, and he said that was worth something, knowing someone understood what it had cost, and they sat in Mrs. Fremont's cafe in the gray winter light, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his, a deliberate and unambiguous gesture, and he looked down at her hand and then up at her face, and the thing that was between them was fully visible to both of them, no longer something to observe carefully from a distance. "Martha," he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very certain. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to anything he had said aloud, but was an answer nonetheless. He looked at her with the full, open attention of a man who had stopped calculating and decided to simply see what was in front of him. "I have been in love with you since the night you danced," he said. "I have been trying to be sensible about it." She laughed, a real and genuine laugh, the kind she only had with him. "I was in love with you at least 6 weeks ago, and I have been writing better copy ever since, so I am choosing to consider it professionally beneficial." The smile that crossed his face at that was the best thing she had seen in as long as she could remember. He turned his hand under hers and held it properly, fingers interlaced, and they sat like that in Mrs. Fremont's cafe while the December wind pressed at the glass, and she thought that this was what it felt like to have something you had not let yourself want become real. The winter moved forward, and the town of Caldwell moved with it, and Martha Bancroft and Aaron Whitaker moved within it together, in the particular way of 2 people who have decided on each other, which is to say with a settled, daily growing assurance that was very different from the cautious circling of the preceding months. He came to town more often. She went out to the ranch more often. They were known in Caldwell as a fact, which in a small frontier town happened quickly and without ceremony, and people seemed to regard them with the slightly surprised approval of observers who had suspected this outcome was probable and were satisfied to see it confirmed. She met Cobb properly and learned that he was originally from Tennessee and had a dry wit that he deployed seldom enough to make each instance count, and she genuinely liked him. She learned the ranch well enough to have preferences about it, which way to walk in the evenings when the light was good, which of the horses she liked besides Duchess, who she still borrowed and who she had developed an actual fondness for. She brought books from the Clarion's small lending shelf when Giddings started one in January, and she and Aaron would sit in the kitchen on the evenings she stayed late and read sometimes in companionable silence, which she found to be one of the finest things two people could do together. He was in love with her in a way that was practical and daily, and expressed more in acts than in declarations, which suited her exactly. He kept a second coffee cup on the shelf that was hers. He asked her opinion about every significant decision he made about the ranch, and he meant the asking, and he used what she said. He told her things, serious and real things about what he thought and felt and feared and hoped, with the same plain directness with which he did everything else. And this openness, this willingness to let himself be known to her, was something she treasured beyond his ability to comprehend. She told him things in return, about Missouri and what she had lost and what she had built since and what she still wanted. About the specific, grinding injustice of being good at something, and having someone decide that the good was irrelevant next to the inconvenience of her existence. About the dance, what it had felt like from inside, the moment she had stood up from the table and walked to the center of that room and decided that she was going to take whatever was being offered and make something of it. I did not feel like the plain one sitting by herself, she told him, when I was dancing. I felt like the only person in the room who knew exactly what they were doing. You were, he said simply. She looked at him. The only person in the room who knew exactly what they were doing, he clarified. Everyone else was just trying to keep up. She felt the warmth of that move through her, not the desperate warmth of someone who needed to be told she was enough, but the settled warmth of someone who was being truly seen, which is a different thing and better. January gave way to February and February to March, and the Kansas plain began its slow, incremental return from winter's austerity, the ground softening, the first spare hints of green appearing along the creek banks, the birds coming back from wherever they went and bringing with them a sound that Martha associated so strongly with the beginning of things that it made her heart lift every time. She had spoken with Samuel Giddings about a more formal arrangement at the Clarion. She wanted to be the editor of record for the social and community section of the paper, a formal title rather than the informal, expansive role she had been filling, with appropriate compensation. Giddings had taken 3 days to think about this, and then offered her $15 a month and the title of associate editor, which she accepted after a counter-negotiation that landed them at $18 with a review in 6 months. She shook his hand over it and felt the ground shift under her feet in the good way, the way it shifts when something you worked for becomes real. She told Aaron over their Wednesday dinner, and he was genuinely, comprehensively pleased for her, not the polite pleased of someone who does not entirely follow why this matters, but the real pleased of someone who understands what she has built and what it cost, and is glad to see it recognized. Associate Editor Bancroft, he said, and there was a warmth in how he said her name that made her want to correct him to something else, and know it was too soon and be glad about the too soon of it, which meant there was a when. Spring came in earnest, and with it the return of the cattle trade's higher season, which meant the town was busier, and the ranch was busier, and they both worked harder but had developed by now the practiced ease of two people who have factored each other into their sense of what a good day looks like, who find in each other's company not an interruption from their own purposes but an extension of them. He proposed to her in April. They were walking along the creek that ran through the eastern edge of the ranch property, in the particular light of a late April afternoon when the Kansas sky is a profound, cloudless blue, and the new grass is a shade of green that exists only in spring and only on the plains. He had not planned it with the elaborate stage management of a man trying to create an occasion. He had simply been walking beside her and talking about the creek, specifically about the water rights question that she had been covering since the fall and that had finally been resolved in a ruling that she considered only partially just. And he had stopped walking and she had stopped because he had. And he had turned to look at her with the full, steady attention she knew, and he had said, "I want to marry you, Martha. Not I wonder if you would consider. Not it would make me very happy if." Just the plain, direct, honest want of a man who had decided what was true and was saying it. She looked at him in the April light, this man who had asked her to dance as an act of charity and been silenced by what she did with it, who had apologized for the wrong reason and stayed for the right ones, who read Emerson and cooked his own supper and reported fraudulent land dealings to the sheriff at the cost of a 3-year friendship because it was right, who listened to her as if what she said was the most interesting thing he had heard and always made her feel like the full, complete person she actually was. "I want to marry you too," she said, in the same plain, direct way, because she was Martha Bancroft and she had never been able to do the indirect thing when the direct thing was available. He took her hand, and they stood for a moment by the creek in the extraordinary April light, and she felt the world arranging itself around this moment, this decision, this fact of them, and she thought that here was the place she had been looking for. Not just a place she had made for herself. A place she was making here with him, that was both hers and theirs, and neither diminished by being both. They were married in June of 1880, at the small Presbyterian church on 3rd Street in Caldwell, with Samuel Giddings and his wife as witnesses and Cobb in his best shirt in the 2nd pew, and Dolores Varga in the 3rd pew wearing a magnificent hat that she had purchased from Clara Dupree's millinery shop, and which everyone agreed was entirely appropriate to the occasion. The ceremony was simple, and the vows were the traditional ones with one small addition, which Martha had asked the minister to include, a sentence about partnership and equal standing, which the minister, who was a sensible man with more flexibility than his congregation always gave him credit for, had added without complaint. Aaron Whitaker looked at Martha Bancroft as she came down the aisle on her own, because there was no one to give her and she had not felt the need to manufacture someone. And the look on his face was the same look he had worn on the dance floor of the dusty Spur Saloon, the look of a man who had expected one thing and encountered something so much more that he had lost, briefly and beautifully, his ordinary composure. She came to stand beside him and she could feel him looking at her, and she looked steadily forward at the minister, because if she looked at Aaron right now, she would not be able to say her vows without her voice doing something unsteady, and she was Martha Bancroft, and she was going to say her vows clearly. She said them clearly. He said his clearly too, and she looked at him when he said them, and his voice was level, and his eyes were entirely steady, and the plain, direct certainty in his face was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They were married, and Cobb led a small and enthusiastic applause from the 2nd pew that spread through the church with the warm inevitability of something that was simply true. The summer of 1880 was the best summer of Martha's life. She moved out to the Crosty with the contents of her trunk and her satchel and her compositing tools, and she kept her arrangement with the Clarion, riding to town on the mornings she was needed, which were most mornings, and coming home in the evenings to the ranch that was now hers as much as his. She made changes to the kitchen garden that she had been mentally designing since November, and Aaron helped her with the heavy work, and neither of them treated her wanting to change things as a conquest, and neither of them treated his willingness to accommodate as a concession. It was simply two people building something together, each bringing what they were good at, each deferring to the other where the other had the better judgment. She wrote. She wrote more than she had written since Wichita, and she wrote better. The Clarion pieces, yes, but also longer work, careful and detailed examinations of the frontier community that had been forming in her notebooks for months, and that she was slowly beginning to understand as something more than newspaper copy. She had an idea for a book eventually, and she told Aaron about it one evening, and he listened with complete attention, and then asked 3 questions about structure and evidence that were so precisely right that she looked at him with open admiration. And he said modestly that he had simply thought about what information he would want if he were the reader. And she said that was exactly what writing was, and he looked pleased in the quiet, private way he had of being pleased. He was happy, too, in ways that were legible to her and perhaps to no one else. He smiled more, and not just the small, wry smiles he had deployed as a bachelor, but real, full smiles that he seemed to be somewhat surprised by, as if happiness had presented itself unexpectedly in the middle of an ordinary task, and he had found it there, and was not sure yet of its dimensions. He talked more, in the evenings particularly, at the kitchen table with the fire going and the wind outside doing whatever the Kansas wind was doing, which was always something decided and insistent. He talked about his years in Texas and things he had thought about and not had anyone to say to, and she listened the way he listened to her, with the full, particular attention that says the speaker is the most important thing in the room, and he talked himself sometimes into a surprised clarity about things he had not known he had been thinking, and looked across the table at her with a gratitude that was very close to awe. They were, in the plain and unflowery sense, deeply happy together. In the autumn of 1880, Martha discovered she was pregnant. She worked this out herself, with the pragmatic self-knowledge she applied to her own body as to everything else, and she confirmed it with Mrs. Holt, who was the closest thing Caldwell had to a physician for women's matters, and she came home to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon and told Aaron while he was mending a fence post on the east side of the property. He went very still for a moment, the way he went still when something large and important was happening, and he was deciding how to be in it. Then he looked at her with an expression that she did not have a word for, and was not sure any language had a word for, something between joy and solemn gratitude, and something so deep and private that she felt almost reverent seeing it on his face. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and took her face in both his hands carefully, as if she were made of something extraordinary, and he said nothing for a long moment, and then he said her name, just Martha, in a voice that was not quite steady, and she put her hands over his and felt something in her that was equally without a name and equally true. "Are you afraid?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "So am I," he said. "We will be afraid together and it will be all right." She believed him. She believed him not because she was credulous or because love had made her incautious, but because Aaron Whitaker had never told her anything that was not true and had never promised her anything he did not intend to keep. And this was not the first difficult thing they had faced together, and she knew what facing difficult things with him felt like. She kept working through the winter, because the work was hers, and she was not going to surrender it, and there was no reason to. Samuel Giddings, when she told him, had the brief, reflexive look of a man wondering about practical implications, and then he looked at her steady face and said, "Well, Mrs. Whitaker, we will sort out the schedule as the time comes." And that was the end of it. She wrote through the winter, good copy, clean and useful and honest, and she continued the longer writing in the evenings. And Aaron kept the ranch running through the cold, and they had Cobb and a new hand, a young man named Peter from Nebraska who was steady and willing and reminded Martha, in his eager earnestness, of what the world looked like to someone who had not yet been disappointed by it. The spring of 1881 brought the usual Kansas renewal and something more specific and immediate. On a morning in late April, when the same April light that had been over the creek when Aaron proposed was again over the crosty, their son was born. He was healthy and loud, and had his father's hair already and Martha's expression, which Aaron said was the look of someone assessing the situation and finding it adequate but acknowledging the possibility of improvement. They named him James, for no particular dynastic reason, but because it was a solid, good name that suited the weight and the fact of him. Martha held him in the morning light and felt a love so large and so direct that it required no management or translation, the rarest thing in her experience, a feeling that needed no arrangement. She looked at Aaron sitting beside the bed with his forearms on his knees, and his eyes entirely full of something that was not in any frontier newspaper she had ever read. And she thought that she had come to Caldwell, Kansas, with $43 and a satchel and a specific plan. And the plan had been good, and what she had in addition to the plan was better than anything the plan had contained. The summer James was born was the summer she finished the first long draft of what she was calling her territory piece, the extended examination of the communities of the Caldwell region, their economics and social structures, and the people who built them. The Swedish wheat farmers and the Mexican-American businesswomen and the range hands and the newspaper people and the ranchers and the women who ran boarding houses and millinery shops and who formed the actual tissue of a frontier town, far more than the gunfights and cattle drives that made it into the Eastern papers. Giddings read the draft and sat with it for a week and then said, with considerable gravity for a man who had a light touch generally, that she should send it to a publisher in Kansas City, and that he would write a letter of recommendation if she wanted one. She sent it in September with Giddings's letter and her own covering letter, which was 2 paragraphs, and said what it needed to say without a syllable's waste, and she settled in to wait. The autumn was full and good. James grew with the determined energy of a healthy child who has every intention of mastering the world on schedule, and the ranch produced well, and Martha was fully herself, writing for the paper and working on the second draft of the book, and being a mother and a wife with the same direct engagement she brought to everything. She did not find these things in opposition. She was not the kind of person who divided herself into categories. She was Martha Bancroft, who was also Martha Whitaker, and she was the same complete and practical and passionate person in all the rooms of her life. The publisher wrote back in November. They were interested. They wanted revisions on the first section and a meeting in Kansas City in the spring. She read the letter standing at the kitchen table and felt the particular, cool satisfaction of something she had worked very hard for arriving in the shape she had hoped it would. Aaron came in from the barn and saw her face and said, immediately, "Good news." "Very good news," she said. He crossed the kitchen and read the letter over her shoulder, one hand settling at her back with the absent, natural warmth of a man who has stopped thinking about the gesture and simply makes it. And she felt the hand there, and felt the warmth of him at her back, and felt the kitchen around them with the fire going and James asleep in the next room, and the November wind outside doing what November wind in Kansas does. "Kansas City in the spring," he said. "Yes. We will go to Kansas City in the spring," he said, as if it had already been decided, because with Aaron Whitaker it was always that simple. She needed to go somewhere and so they would go. That was what people who were genuinely together did. She turned and looked at him, this man who had transformed from a stranger with a kind meant and somewhat mortifying offer into the person she could not imagine her life without, and she thought about all of it, the dance and the apology and the cold coffee and the creek in April and James sleeping in the next room, and she felt the full weight of the life she had built, not alone, not given to her, not inherited or stumbled into, but built day by day from the inside out. With her own hands and her own words and her own stubborn, specific self. "Aaron," she said, "yes, you have been the best surprise of my life." He looked at her with those steady eyes. "You danced," he said simply. "I was never the same after." She laughed, and he smiled the real smile, the one she had watched grow from something occasional and surprised into something constant and reliable, the most familiar thing she knew. And she put her hands against his chest, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in their kitchen in November in Caldwell, Kansas, in 1881. And outside the wind was doing what the wind does, and inside everything was exactly what it should be. The months that followed brought their own accumulation of good things, the daily, irreplaceable small good things that make up the actual texture of a life. James took his first steps on a Wednesday morning in February while Aaron was in the kitchen, and Martha was at the table with her papers. And she looked up at the sound of Aaron's voice, saying, "Martha, look." And she looked, and there was her son, upright and luminous with his own achievement, crossing the 3 feet between the chair he had released and his father's waiting hands. And she was on her feet without knowing she had stood up, and both of them were crouching on the kitchen floor, and James was between them, triumphant and slightly astonished, and it was the most ordinary, extraordinary moment she had ever witnessed. Spring came again, the third spring of her life in Caldwell, and in April they made the trip to Kansas City, the three of them, on the railroad that had come through that part of Kansas the previous year, a trip that James found so comprehensively fascinating that he did not sleep for most of it, and arrived in Kansas City with the energized, huge-eyed look of a child who has exceeded his own capacity for experience. The meeting with the publisher went well, better than well. The editor, a precise and serious woman named Mrs. Eudora Marsh, who had the manner of someone who had read everything worth reading and had strong opinions about what made the rest of it worth publishing, read Martha's revisions with close attention, and then asked her, for 2 hours, the most pointed and excellent questions about her material that anyone had ever asked. And Martha answered them with the plain, confident thoroughness of someone who knew exactly what they had written and why. And at the end Mrs. Marsh said, in a tone that admitted nothing as uncomplicated as enthusiasm, but was nonetheless unmistakable, that they would be proceeding with publication. Martha sat in the publisher's office in Kansas City with her hands in her lap and felt the words arrive and settle, and she thought, calmly and fully, "This is real. This is mine. I did this." She looked at Aaron, who was sitting beside her with James on his knee looking at a picture book that the publisher's assistant had thoughtfully produced, and he was looking at her with the expression that was now the most familiar and beloved thing in her world, the expression that said she was fully seen, entirely known, completely loved. She reached over and took his hand. They went back to Caldwell on the spring train with the publication agreement in her satchel and James asleep between them on the seat, and the Kansas plain spread out under the afternoon sky in every direction, vast and specific and particular, and Martha looked at it through the train window and thought that it was hers now, this land, this place, in the way that a place belongs to you when you have put your story into it. The book was published in the autumn of 1882 by the Kansas City House under the title Communities of the Frontier, The Human Landscape of the Caldwell Territory, by Martha Whitaker, and it was reviewed well in several Kansas papers and one paper in St. Louis, and Samuel Giddings ran a review in the Clarion that was 3 columns long and called it a document of permanent value, which was the highest praise he was capable of, and both of them knew it. Dollars Varga bought 3 copies. Astrid Heller, who read the chapter about her family's wheat farm with the careful attention of a woman who knew the weight of being written about honestly, sent Martha a letter in Swedish that she had her eldest daughter translate, which said, in part, that it was good to be seen by someone who looked without deciding first what they would find. Martha kept that letter in her satchel, alongside the letter of introduction that had brought her to Caldwell 3 years before, because she was a woman who kept the documents that mattered. That winter, James began talking in the earnest, exploratory way of a child learning that language is the primary tool of everything, and his first clear sentence, delivered at the breakfast table on a January morning with the conviction of a person making an announcement, was "Papa, horse," which Aaron received with the gravity it deserved and said yes, they would go see the horses, and Martha looked at the two of them and felt that same nameless, enormous, unpretentious love. She discovered she was expecting again in the spring of 1883, and this time she was less afraid, not because the fear was entirely gone, but because she knew by now that she and Aaron were very good at the difficult things, which made them better at the ordinary things, and made the joyful things almost unbearable in the best way. Their daughter was born in November of 1883, healthy and loud, and immediately possessed of an opinion about every aspect of her situation. They named her Clara, for the milliner on Caldwell's Main Street, who had given Martha a cup of tea on a difficult day in her first week in the town, and who had become, over the years, one of the closest friends she had. Clara's arrival made James thoughtful and occasionally territorial, and eventually, over the course of several weeks, genuinely interested in her as a person, which Martha considered a reasonable developmental arc, and which Aaron handled with the patient steadiness that characterized everything he did. The ranch grew in those years, slowly and deliberately, in the way that Aaron grew everything, with care and without hurry. They added a proper sitting room to the house in 1884, and a second bedroom, and a covered porch on the east side where Martha liked to write in the mornings when the weather was warm enough, with the plain stretching away toward the horizon and the particular quality of plain silence that is not actually quiet but full of 1,000 specific sounds if you have learned to hear them. She kept writing for the Clarion until Giddings retired in 1885 and sold the paper to a young man named Holloway who was earnest and moderately competent and who understood, in their initial conversation, that Martha Whitaker was the institutional knowledge of that publication, and that he would be wise to treat her accordingly. He did treat her accordingly. The column she had been writing for 2 years, a regular commentary on community and justice and the daily reality of frontier life, continued under Holloway's ownership and reached more readers as the town grew. She was working on a second book, more directly a history this time, about the founding generation of Caldwell's community, the people who had come before the cattle drives made it famous and the railroad made it permanent. It would take her 3 years to write, and it would be published in 1888, and it would be the work she was proudest of, though she would not know that for some time. On a Saturday evening in the summer of 1885, Caldwell held its annual midsummer gathering at the town hall, a large, loud celebration that had been growing every year as the town grew, with dancing and food and a general atmosphere of determined enjoyment. Martha and Aaron went together, James running ahead of them into the light and noise with the fearless energy of a 4-year-old who owned the world, and Clara on Aaron's arm, a bright, watchful 1-year-old with her mother's eyes and her father's composure. The dancing started up, and James immediately attempted to join it and fell down immediately, and stood up again without distress and tried again. And Martha watched him from the side of the room and felt something she recognized with a small, private shock as a memory of herself, that quality in a person of getting up without complaint and going at it again, as if falling down were simply a phase of learning rather than a reason to stop. Old Hector Voss was still playing piano, 5 years on, still cycling through his familiar repertoire with unaltered fidelity. He started a waltz and Martha felt it in her chest the way she always felt that particular tempo, a pull that was not quite physical and not quite emotional but somewhere in between. Aaron appeared at her side, having handed Clara to Clara's godmother Dolores Varga, who was standing nearby in another magnificent hat. He stood beside Martha and watched the dancing for a moment. "I wonder," he said, in a voice she knew and loved past all words, "if you would like to dance." She looked at him, this man. The whole story of them in his face, in the steady eyes and the small, full smile and the hand he held out to her, the same hand she had taken 5 years ago on a Friday evening when she was a stranger in a room full of people who were not looking at her. "Yes," she said, "I would." She took his hand and they walked to the center of the floor and the music took them and Martha Whitaker danced, not like she had something to prove this time. Not with the contained, brilliant defiance of a woman who had been looked past and was refusing it. She danced with the open, generous joy of someone who had built a life and knew it and was standing in the middle of it, surrounded by the evidence of everything she had made. She danced with her husband, and they moved together with the ease of 2 people who had learned each other completely, who had navigated grief and difficulty and the ordinary wear of years, and found each other consistently on the other side of all of it. She danced in the hall in Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1885, with her son on the edge of the floor, attempting to waltz with a girl his own age, and her daughter watching from Dolores Varga's arms and her husband's hand in hers. She had arrived in this town with $43 and a satchel and a plan, and a stubborn, specific self that she had refused to surrender regardless of what the world had asked of her. And she had made from those materials a life so full and so real and so entirely hers that she could stand in the middle of it and feel no lack. Aaron danced with her, and he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, from the very beginning, with that speechless, honest wonder of a man who had expected one thing and encountered something so much greater. And his eyes were on her face, and his hand was warm, and the music was old and good, and the hall was full of the life they had made here together, in this place that was no longer a fresh start but simply home. Still speechless, she asked him because she was Martha Bancroft Whitaker, and she had never been able to resist the honest question when she had it. He laughed, the full, real laugh that was one of the best sounds she knew. "Every day," he said. She smiled, and they turned in the music, and the dance went on.